Welcome back to Her Take by Laila Jean Yu Says. I'm your host, Laila. So recently I was watching the documentary Boy Band Confidential, and there was something that really stood out to me while they were talking about the success of New Edition and later Boyz II Men. And the more I sat with it, the more I started thinking, why does it seem like black male groups build the blueprint, but once the formula becomes massively profitable, the industry shifts its attention somewhere else? And before anybody gets defensive, let me say this right now. This episode is not about saying white boy bands weren't talented. That is not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is that there seems to be a historical pattern in the music industry where black artists create a sound, a style, an image, or formula. And then once corporations realize how profitable it can be, they often push a more commercial safe version for the forefront. And honestly, that pattern deserves a conversation. I also want to say that I'm just going to keep it a buck. I'm going to keep it real. I don't care what anybody says. When it came to white boy bands who kind of sound like Boyz II Men and New Edition, you could never, ever in your life outstage the blueprint. Because just because you seem soulful, you are not soulful. You cannot package something that the blueprint started, have a lived experience. I just want to say that because it seems as though that when it comes to Boyz II Men versus 98 Degrees, if you had to compare their vocals, which one sounds more vocally ranged? Have you not heard Can You Stay in the Rain? It's hard to say goodbye to yesterday, End of the Road, Pass You By. The vocal range was on point. What you're seeing when it came to 90 Degrees, Backstreet Boys, New Kids on the Block, the blueprint started it. I said the fuck what I said, so let's get into it. Let's start with New Edition. New Edition came from the early 90s, and they were huge. The young black boys, matching outfits, choreography, harmonies, teen appeal, R&B mixed with pop sensibility. That formula sounds very familiar because when people think of modern boy band structure, they often think about groups that came later. But New Edition helped define the formula long before many of those later groups exploded globally. And what's interesting is shortly after New Edition rises, here comes New Kids on the Block. But it's impossible not to notice the similarities in structure and marketing. And one thing the music industry has always understood is this: if something works in black music spaces, there's potential to make it even bigger commercially. That's just the truth. And honestly, when I really sat back and thought about it, I was like, my fucking God. New Edition really helped shape what we now recognize as the modern boy band formula. The choreography, the harmonies, the matching outfits, the teen appeal. All of that was already happening. So sometimes I get confused when people talk about later groups like they invented something brand new. Now let's talk about Boyz II Men. Boyz II Men were absolutely dominating in the early to mid 1990s. Their harmonies was fucking insane. Their vocals was untouchable and timeless. And their emotional storytelling was out of this world. No one can touch it. They were untouchable. They weren't just successful black artists, they were mainstream superstars. And during that era, you also had groups like Soul for Real, Shy, Silk, Portrait, All for One, and Drew Hill. And don't forget 112. Black male harmony grooves were everywhere in the 90s. But then something shifted towards the late 1990s. Now suddenly the industry heavily pivoted towards Backstreet Boys, NSYNC, and 98 Degrees. And these groups were absolutely dominating pop culture. TRL, MTV, teen magazines, global marketing, mall tours, and massive sponsorships. The machine behind them was huge. And what I started wondering was, why did it feel like black R&B groups began fading from the center of mainstream visibly once those groups enter the picture? And that's the part that really bothered me emotionally, because I remember how massive Boyz II Men were. They weren't some small niche group, they were everywhere. So to watch the industry shift so aggressively afterward made me start questioning how the music industry decides who gets long-term mainstream support. Now I need to pause here because people get weird whenever race enters conversation about entertainment. Acknowledging pattern is not hate. Saying the industry treats artists differently based on race is not the same thing as attacking individual artists. Let that fucking sink in your head. Because the truth is, a lot of those white boy bands are talented. I'm gonna say some. Not a lot, some. But talent alone does not explain marketing budgets. Talent alone does not explain radio access. Talent alone does not explain who gets labeled universal. And that is a deeper conversation because Black artists have historically been placed into categories like urban, R&B, niche. Meanwhile, white artists doing very similar sounds are often marketed as mainstream, global, for everybody. And once you notice a pattern, it's hard to unsee it. And let's really talk about that for a second because I've always hated how Black artists get boxed into categories. Like, why is Black music always treated like a separate department when Black culture influenced almost every part of the popular music? That never made sense to me. One thing that really stood out to me while watching Boy Band Confidential was realizing a lot of these feelings Black artists had about the industry weren't imagined. The documentary literally gave examples of how the industry was shifting. For example, Boyz II Men member Sean Stockman confirmed that Motown dropped Boyz II Men in favor of 90 Degrees. And when I heard that, I paused because Boyz II Men were one of the biggest vocal groups of the 1990s. So hearing that really reinforced the idea that the industry was changing priorities. And what made it even deeper was learning that 90 Degrees became the first white boy band signed to Motown. Now that is a conversation because Motown historically represented Black music excellence. When even historically Black labels began shifting towards white pop groups, it says a lot about where the industry believed the money was going. And honestly, that's bigger than music. That's about business. That's about marketability. That's about who corporations believe can sell globally. Another thing that stood out to me was the story behind Invisible Man. The song was originally submitted for Boyz II Men, but according to the documentary, the president of Motown gave the song to 90 Degrees instead. And once again, that made me stop and think because those are the types of industry decisions people don't usually see publicly. We only see the final product. We don't always see the shift happening behind the scenes. And the more examples the documentary gave, the more it became for me to ignore the pattern. Once again, that made me stop and think because these are the types of industry decisions people don't usually see publicly. We only see the final product. We don't always see the shifts happening behind the scenes. And the more examples the documentary gave, the harder it became for me to ignore the pattern. So I was listening to Visible Man. When I tell you that song was for Boyz II Men, that song was written to Boyz II Men. I don't like that song. I'm going to tell you why. Because to be honest with you, I wasn't really a fan of 90 Degrees. I heard them and I pretty much bypassed them. They weren't my cup of tea. But if you listen to Boyz II Men, like Motown Philly, I'll Make Love to You, Water Runs Dry, Pass You By, their a cappella song, Can You Stand the Rain, that makes you want to sit down and just continue to listen to them and watch them. I promise you, if Motown gave that record to Invisible Man, Boyz II Men would have so much support. But it's okay because clearly we see which group is still standing and still touring. So the fuck what I said. Anyways, let's not forget this either. Boyz II Men Mariah Carey had One Sweet Day in 1995, one of the biggest songs of that era. That song was massive. And despite Boyz II Men being nominated for 6 Grammys, they walked away with none. And honestly, that's another conversation people have been having for years when it comes to Black artists and award shows. Because Black artists influence culture heavily, but recognition doesn't always reflect it equally. And something else I found interesting was hearing how exhausted Boyz II Men became during that period. They took a year off, canceled the European tour, and by 1997, the culture had already shifted. And that part honestly made me sad because the music industry moves fast. One minute you're dominating, and the next minute the machine has moved on. And for Black artists especially, it sometimes feels like they have less room to slow down before the industry starts looking for the next thing. And for the documentary, also talked about All for One. And honestly, their experience really opened my eyes too. Jamie Jones talked about how being a multiracial group affected how seriously they were taken. According to the documentary, Atlantic Records reportedly did not want their photo on the album cover. Black radio stations reportedly would not play I Swear. And what's crazy is they even mentored the Backstreet Boys on their tour bus in Orlando. But later, their own label reportedly told them to be more like Backstreet Boys. And honestly, that part hit me hard. Because imagine helping open doors for a style of group, only to later be told you need to become more like the people who came after you. And Jamie Jones said something that really stayed with me. He basically said that if you're telling me I need to be him, then you must think I'm not good enough to be me. Ooh, child. That line says everything because at its core, this conversation is really about validation. Who gets validated, who gets fully invested, and who the industry quietly decides no longer enough. Because we have to ask, why are Black artists often expected to stay inside racialized genres? Why does Black music get separated from pop when Black artists helped create a modern pop culture in the first place? A lot of people don't realize how much Black artistry shaped what became mainstream music culture. The harmonies, the vocal runs, the emotional vulnerability, the choreography, the fashion, the performance style. So much of that was already happening in the Black music spaces before the industry decided to mass market it globally. And again, this isn't about saying white artists copy everything. It's about recognizing that the industry often invests differently depending who's delivering the product. That's the conversation. And honestly, I think corporations have always viewed whiteness as safer financially, not better, not more talented, just safer to market globally. And I think that reality makes people uncomfortable because nobody wants to admit how much race influenced business decisions. Now, let's talk business because at the end of the day, the music industry follows money. Labels look at who can sell globally, who can appeal to a suburban audience, who can get massive corporate sponsorships, who can dominate teen consumer markets. And historically, whiteness has been treated as more commercially safe by corporations. That doesn't mean more talented, it means more marketable within systems already built around white center standards. And I think that's why so many Black R&B groups from the 80s and 90s didn't disappear because they lacked skill. A lot of them got overshadowed by an industry shift. The machine moved elsewhere. And once labels decide where the money is going, that changes everything. Promotion, visibility, radio, television, award shows, and media coverage. Everything. That's probably why this conversation frustrates me so much because it's not just about music. You see this pattern over and over again in fashion, social media trends, beauty, slang, dance. Black people create culture constantly, and then suddenly it becomes more accepted when somebody else repackages it. One thing about Black artists, we innovate constantly. Black culture has influenced nearly every major genre of popular music. And what frustrates people sometimes is not seeing that innovation fully credited the way it deserves to be. Because the difference between creating culture and fully benefiting from it long term. And I think that's why conversation like this matter. Not to erase anyone else's success, but to tell the full story. And honestly, this pattern exists outside the music too. You see it in fashion, social media trends, dance, language, beauty trends, entertainment in general. Black creativity often shapes culture first. Then once it becomes profitable on a massive scale, larger systems decide who gets pushed as the face of it. That's a real conversation. And avoiding that conversation doesn't make the pattern disappear. So here's where I land on all of this. New Kids on the Block was a carbon copy of what New Edition built. 90 Degrees was a carbon copy of what Boyz II Men perfected. The industry took the blueprint, the sound, the energy, the formula, and handed it to someone else and called that someone else the next big thing. But here's what the industry never understood. Here's what they got wrong every single time they try to replace one with the other. You can study the blueprint, you can copy the moves, you can learn the harmonies, you can sign the look-alike and market the sound alike and push them to the top of the charts. But you cannot manufacture soul. You cannot manufacture the lived experience. And that makes music feel like it reaches inside your chest and grabs something. You cannot replicate what New Edition had. You cannot replicate what Boyz II Men had. You cannot replicate what All For One had, what Soul For Real had, what any of these groups had. At the end of the day, this episode is not about attacking individual artists. It is about questioning the industry itself. It is about asking who gets marketed as universal, who gets long-term investment, who gets remembered as a face of a movement, and who quietly gets pushed to the background once the money gets bigger. Because Black artists have always been innovators. The issue is that innovation and recognition are not always distributed equally. Because the blueprint was Black, and Black excellence, real Black excellence, cannot be duplicated. It can only be originated. And no matter how many times the industry tried to replace it, no matter how many times they handed the machine to someone else and redirected the money and the mainstream recognition, they can never get what the originals had, because you can never duplicate the blueprint. This has been Her Take by Laila Jean Yu Says. If this episode hit you, and I have a feeling it did, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave us a comment. Follow Her Take on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, and Threads. And I will see you next time. Peace.